Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a philosopher or a king, but with something far more dangerous and complicated, dating in the Middle Ages. Because believe it or not, finding love in a time of plagues, dowries and chaperones was somehow even more awkward than texting someone, "What you doing?" at 2 a.m. From courtly love songs to marriage by livestock negotiation, medieval romance was less about butterflies and more about land rights. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you're standing in a medieval village, or maybe a chilly stone castle, wondering how to find love. Maybe strike up a conversation? Compliment someone's hose? Ask if they come here often? Nope. That's not how any of this works. If you're in the Middle Ages, dating, in the modern sense, doesn't really exist. You don't flirt, text, or go for long walks to see where it goes. Instead, your parents, or your lord or your abbot, are already deciding who you'll marry, when, and how many cows it will take to seal the deal. If you're a noble, you've probably been betrothed since before your voice dropped. You and your future spouse might meet for the first time on your wedding day. And yes, that's just as uncomfortable as it sounds. The whole thing is about land, titles, and family alliances. Not compatibility or how good they are at lute solos. If you're a peasant, things are slightly less formal, but only slightly. Your family still has a strong say, and love isn't really part of the discussion. Maybe your parents know a nice girl whose family owns a productive goat. Maybe they admire a boy who can thatch a roof without falling off. Boom. You're courting now. Lucky you. It's not that people in the Middle Ages don't feel romantic. They do. It's just not the priority. The goal is survival, inheritance, and social stability. Falling in love before marriage? That's risky. Falling in love outside of marriage? That's scandalous. Either way, it's frowned upon. Unless you're a character in a tragic poem, in which case, go wild. And yet, you dream. Maybe you write a little verse on a scrap of parchment. Maybe you sneak a glance across the market. Maybe, just maybe, you fall for someone who wasn't pre-approved by your family's livestock appraiser. But for now, you wait, you obey, you try not to fall for the miller's apprentice. Because in this world, love might be the goal of poets, but marriage is the work of parents, priests, and politics. So you think someone's cute. Maybe it's the way they balance a basket of onions on their head. Maybe it's the confident way they beat mud off a rug. Your medieval heart skips a beat. But steady yourself. Because in this world, romance doesn't bloom without a balance sheet. Before you even think about courtship, you'd better ask, what do I bring to the table? And if your answer is a charming personality, you might want to sit down. If you're a young man, you'll need land, or livestock, or tools, or a roof that doesn't leak too much. Love letters are nice, but nothing says husband material like 2 healthy oxen and a roof that can survive a mild storm. If your father has already promised the best goat to your brother, well, you might want to consider the priesthood. If you're a young woman, your family needs a dowry. That could be coin, clothing, or a suspiciously generous number of geese. Doesn't matter how witty you are, if your family can't pay up, you're likely to spend a long time perfecting your embroidery alone. Now let's say you actually like someone. Someone who makes your calloused heart flutter. You lock eyes at the well. There's a spark. It's romantic. It's poetic. It's completely irrelevant, because unless your families are on equal financial footing, you might as well fall in love with a cloud. If you're noble, it gets worse. Your hand in marriage is tied to land, borders, and political favours. You're not just a person. You're a walking treaty. Congratulations. Even peasants aren't safe. Marriage is practical. You don't marry for butterflies. You marry because your pig pen borders someone else's wheat field. You dream of passion. You settle for irrigation rights. And yet, you try. Maybe you offer a small gift, a carved spoon, a handful of berries, or your finest slightly cracked mug. Maybe they smile, maybe they don't. But the truth remains. In medieval dating, economics is the flirting, and love is just a bonus you hope your spouse develops eventually. So let's say you're not a peasant worrying about pigs or a noble dealing with treaties. Let's say you're a knight. Shiny armour, big horse, questionable poetry skills. What's your love life like? Welcome to the strange and emotionally exhausting world of courtly love. Now, this isn't dating. This is performance art. Courtly love was a noble pastime, part flirting, part spiritual suffering, and entirely impractical. You, the brave knight, choose a noble lady, usually one who's already married, and vow to adore her from afar. Not physically, of course. That would ruin everything. No, you're supposed to suffer. Elegantly. You might compose a few tortured verses about her silver laugh, or how her hair burns like the sun, which, in medieval terms, means she has hair and didn't insult your family. You wear her colours at tournaments. You pine. You sigh. You occasionally joust someone just because he glanced at her too long. The lady's role? She's supposed to pretend this is all very flattering while maintaining a level of icy detachment that would terrify a glacier. She may respond with a letter, a token, maybe a ribbon, but mostly she'll just be mysterious and unattainable, which is the entire point. The emotions are high, the actual contact, minimal. At best, you might get a nod from across the hall or a finger brushed against your gauntlet during a feast. Anything more, and suddenly it's not courtly love. It's a scandal. Or worse, adultery. And no one wants that. At least, not officially. This entire setup worked best when everyone involved agreed it was mostly pretend. It was a way to express longing, devotion, and creative angst, all without disrupting the social order. A medieval venting mechanism, if you will. Was it dramatic? Absolutely. Did it involve more poetry than practicality? Constantly. But for a knight stuck between battles and boredom, courtly love gave you something to write about, and someone to write for. Just don't expect a happy ending, or a kiss, or even eye contact. So you've fallen for someone. Great. Now comes the hard part, expressing that affection in a society where touching someone's hand without a chaperone is basically a declaration of war. Welcome to the medieval solution. Tokens. Think of it as 12th century texting. Slow, confusing, and open to wildly inaccurate interpretation. Let's say you're a knight, and you're hopelessly in love with Lady Marjorie, of whatever her last name is. You can't speak to her alone, and your poems keep getting intercepted by her confessor. What do? You send her a glove. Or maybe your embroidered sleeve. Nothing says I love you like mailing someone part of your wardrobe. And if you're on the receiving end? Congratulations. You now have a sweaty linen sleeve you didn't ask for, and the romantic burden of pretending you know what it means. Is he confessing love? Asking for a favour? Suggesting a duel? Who knows? Women gave tokens too. A ribbon, a piece of hair, a tiny pendant. It was sentimental, sure, but also deeply strategic. Give the wrong guy the wrong token, and suddenly you're spoken for by someone with a lazy eye and a drinking problem. Tokens were meant to be subtle. A glove pinned to your chest, a ribbon tied to your sword hilt. Everyone knew what it meant, and no one said what it meant. The more cryptic, the better. It was less about communication and more about plausible deniability. Oh, this glove? No, it's not from Lady Joan. It just appeared on my pillow, scented with lavender, completely random. For commoners, tokens were simpler. Maybe a wood carving, maybe a handkerchief you stitched when you weren't milking something. It was still romantic, just with more calluses involved. Tokens were also risky. Giving one to the wrong person could spark rumours. Receiving one you didn't want meant figuring out how to politely return someone's sock without insulting their lineage. But for all the awkwardness, these tokens carried real emotional weight. They were symbols of love in a world that didn't allow much room for it. So you finally build up the courage to talk to your crush. Maybe offer them a flower. Maybe quote a little bad poetry you definitely didn't steal from a travelling minstrel. You're ready for a moment of intimacy. Unfortunately, you're not alone. Welcome to the world of medieval dating surveillance, where love is never blind. It's heavily monitored by your mother, your priest, a nosy cousin, and sometimes all three at once. Let's say you're a young woman of marrying age. You're never just going for a walk. You're going for a walk with Margaret and her terrifyingly strict aunt, who's already judging your posture. Even if you're simply fetching water, someone is watching. Someone is always watching. It's less dating, more espionage. And if you're a man trying to court someone, better hope you have the approval of her family, her parish priest, and the local gossip network. You show up at her house with flowers? Her father's behind the door, sharpening something. Her mother's pretending to stir a pot that hasn't boiled in 3 hours, and the village priest just happens to be passing by on his way to morning prayers at sunset. The logic behind all this supervision was simple. Protect virtue, preserve family honour, and absolutely prevent any unsanctioned touching, especially before marriage, especially alone, especially ever. Chaperones were there to monitor innocent interactions. Group outings, monitored, walks, supervised, sitting within a 2-metre radius of each other on a bench. Only if someone's grandmother is knitting nearby and pretending not to listen. The church, of course, had opinions. Lots of them. It regulated courtship the way a bouncer regulates a nightclub. Priests gave sermons about proper conduct and wrote lengthy treatises on the dangers of flirtation. Yes, that's right. Medieval clergy published anti-flirting manuals. Imagine someone copying those out by candlelight while monks silently judge you from across the scriptorium. Even letter writing wasn't safe. Some monasteries opened love letters just to screen for moral content. That's right, divine censorship. So if you want to fall in love, you'll have to get used to doing it quietly, and in the presence of your entire extended family, and possibly God. So, you're in love. Or at least medieval in love, which is mostly longing, confusion, and a lot of pacing near windows. You've exchanged glances across a feast. Maybe they picked up your dropped handkerchief and didn't immediately throw it into the fire. The tension is unbearable. But you still can't speak freely. There are chaperones, priests, mothers lurking like emotional border patrol agents. So what do? You write a letter. Ah, yes, the secret love letter. The most dangerous piece of parchment since the excommunication notice. This is your chance to confess your heart, using the most cryptic, overly poetic language possible. Because you can't just say, I like you. You must say, my soul is a stag, pierced by the arrow of your grace, roaming the forests of yearning. Naturally, if you're literate, which, let's be honest, isn't a given, you pen your message on vellum or rough parchment. If you're really dedicated, you dust it with flower petals or perfume. Just be careful with that. One noble accidentally used a love letter to wrap a herring and delivered it to the wrong girl. They're married now. It's fine. Now comes the problem of delivery. You can't just hand it over. You need a courier, a loyal servant, a bribed monk, or a younger sibling with limited understanding of consequences. Sometimes even a minstrel would do the job, singing your poem in the town square while pretending it was anonymous. Subtle. And the poetry? Risky. Very risky. The line between romantic and heresy was thinner than a monk's patience during Lent. If your metaphor even hinted at anything physical, you might find yourself confessing to both lust and literary exaggeration. But despite all the rules, people did write. Some letters survived. Some poems were copied and passed around like forbidden fruit. In a world of rigid roles and constant supervision, a folded scrap of words could feel revolutionary. So you write, you risk it. You press your trembling hand to the parchment and say everything you can't say aloud. Just don't sign it too clearly. You want romance, not a church trial. Finally, a break, a feast day, a harvest festival, a maypole dance. In short, a rare moment when your life isn't just work, prayer, and pretending you're not interested in the blacksmith's daughter. Today, you're allowed to flirt. Sort of. As long as no one sees. Or everyone sees, but pretends not to. Welcome to medieval festivals, where romance blooms under the watchful eyes of everyone you've ever met, and 3 chickens. Festivals were one of the few socially approved moments when men and women could mingle, laugh, and, dare we say, make eye contact. There's music, there's ale, there's someone wearing a flower crown with dangerous confidence. You've never seen so many people not pretending to be miserable. If you're a peasant, you might try to impress your crush by winning the sack race, catching a greased pig, or juggling 3 stale rolls of bread. Nothing says, "I'm available," like falling off a hay bale with dignity. Dancing was your best shot at actual physical contact. The rules were rigid, but a well-timed spin or a not-quite-accidental hand graze could say more than any poem. The maypole dance, for example, was basically a giant excuse for coordinated flirtation wrapped in ribbons and plausible deniability. And if you're noble? Your version of flirting at a festival involved less hay and more poetry. You might compose a verse on the spot, compare your lady's eyes to twin candles, or other glowing things, and offer a trinket. Hopefully not one that was clearly made by your servant 5 minutes earlier. Food helped too. Offer your beloved a meat pie, or share a honey cake. If they accept it with a smile, you're doing well. If they hand it to their dog, start over with someone else. But remember, everything you do, someone is watching. A parent, a priest, a bard with a big mouth. One misstep, and your flirty smile becomes a youthful indiscretion discussed at church for the next 6 weeks. Still, for a few hours you can pretend. Pretend you're in a world where love isn't a transaction, where laughter isn't suspicious, and where dancing in public doesn't end in penance. Let's say you're not a knight, a noble, or a bard with a lute and excessive feelings. You're a regular villager. You wake up with the cows, go to bed with the chickens, and spend most of your day ankle-deep in mud. You're not looking for a poetic soulmate. You're looking for someone who can milk a goat without emotional drama. Welcome to peasant courtship, where romance is practical, gestures are modest, and chemistry means we can survive winter together. In your world, dating is less about long conversations and more about shared tasks. You notice someone you like because they work hard, don't complain much, and have a decent set of teeth. That's it. That's the whole checklist. You're not picky. You're realistic. You don't need fireworks. You need someone who can gut a fish and maybe doesn't snore too loudly. So how do you show interest? You give gifts, small, useful things. A basket of eggs, a bundle of firewood, a good turnip. And if you're feeling bold, maybe a woven ribbon or a carved spoon. Nothing says, "I'm serious about you," like a spoon you whittled by candlelight while your pig judged you silently. Conversations happen during shared chores. You might walk together to the mill, chat while tending sheep, or exchange pleasantries while shoveling something that smells questionable. No one's reciting poetry. You're talking about the weather, crop yields, and whether or not old Thomas fell in the well again. And yet, in its own way, it's romantic. There's a sweetness in the simplicity. A shared life built not on idealism, but on cooperation. You know each other's strengths, weaknesses, and how fast they run when a goat escapes. Proposals often came quickly. If you both agreed, and the families did too, marriage followed. Maybe you moved into a shared hut. Maybe you built a new one from scratch with help from the village. You brought your best blanket. They brought a goat. Together, you began the strange miracle of domestic survival. It's not glamorous, but it's honest. You've done it. You found someone who can cook, clean, tolerate your family, and doesn't visibly recoil at the sight of your feet. True love, right? Now it's time to get married, which, in medieval terms, means you're entering into a contract. Not a dreamy vow under the stars. A legally binding transaction, often negotiated with all the passion of a livestock auction. If you're a peasant, it's still a big deal. You gather a few witnesses, talk to the local priest, and try not to trip over the Latin during the ceremony. But behind the sweet-sounding blessings is a serious checklist. Dowry, land rights, who gets the cow, and what happens if someone dies during planting season. Ah yes, romance. If you're from the upper class, buckle up. Your marriage is a full-blown legal negotiation. Your parents, their parents, the priest, a scribe, maybe a cousin who once studied law. They're all in on it. The bride and groom, mostly just standing nearby, looking decorative and nodding when spoken to. You may or may not have even met the person you're marrying. Your family has done the math. Your estate needs her fields, her dowry balances your debts, and both of your coats of arms look good next to each other. Love is optional. The merger is not. And once you're married, it's permanent. Divorce isn't really a thing unless you can prove someone wasn't baptized, was secretly related to you, or died and forgot to mention it. Annulments existed, but they required a lot of paperwork, a bit of luck, and a solid bribe. Still, not everything is bleak. Some couples genuinely grew to love each other, shared chores, raising children, surviving winters. These things have a way of building affection, or at least tolerance, which in medieval terms is basically the same thing. The church was involved in every step. Marriage was a holy sacrament, one of the 7 big ones. You didn't just marry for legal reasons, you married because God needed a witness. Possibly 2. So you stand, exchange vows, and smile as someone hands over a sack of onions and calls it a blessing. So, let's say you've had enough. Enough contracts, enough negotiations, enough being treated like a particularly valuable sack of flour. You're a noble, but for once, you want to marry for love. Not for land, not for lineage, not for your father's strategic ambitions, just love. Congratulations, you're about to cause a scandal. Noble elopements were the medieval equivalent of lighting your family tree on fire and dancing in the ashes. If you ran off to marry someone of your own choosing, it wasn't just personal rebellion, it was political sabotage. Let's say you're Lady Eleanor, promised to Sir Boring von Estate Secure, but you've fallen madly in love with a penniless squire who smells faintly of horses and adventure. You meet in secret, whisper sweet nothings in the stables, and one day, you vanish. Off to a monastery where the abbot owes you a favour. There you marry under questionable legality, with only a nervous monk and 2 chickens as witnesses. Back at home, chaos. Your family? Outraged. Your father? Threatening to siege the groom's family garden. Your mother? Crying into her embroidery hoop. The church? Deeply concerned. The gossip? Delicious. And if you're the groom in this romantic rebellion, don't get too comfortable. Best case scenario? You get to keep your bride and your kneecaps. Worst case? You're excommunicated and disemboweled, in that order. Still, some couples got away with it. If the union couldn't be undone without causing even more embarrassment, families sometimes just sighed and moved on. After all, what's done is done, and at least nobody died. Hopefully. In rare cases, these scandals became legends. Songs were written, poems composed, stories whispered at banquets. 2 nobles who chose love over duty. Practically mythological. And yes, most noble marriages were transactional, but these moments, brief rebellions, passionate escapes, whispered vows beneath moonlit towers, they reminded the world that love, though inconvenient, refused to go extinct. So if you ever feel dramatic for swiping left or turning down a second date, just remember, at least your love life doesn't involve secret weddings, angry barons, and a horse tied to a ladder outside your window. Ah, marriage. That beautiful union of 2 souls, and their respective financial portfolios. Because in the Middle Ages love was nice, but a dowry? Now that was truly romantic. Let's say you're a bride. You're not just getting married, you're being launched, like a small dowry-equipped economic vessel. Your family prepares your dowry: money, livestock, land, linens, a cow or two, depending on how lovable they think you are, and maybe even a set of pewter dishes if they're feeling generous. These offerings go to your future husband, who accepts you and your portable wealth with open arms and a mental calculator. Now flip the scenario. In some cultures or regions, it's not the bride's family giving the goods, it's the bride price. The groom pays her family for the honour of marrying her, effectively saying, "Here's a horse, a cloak, and 3 pigs. Now give me your daughter." Medieval romance at its finest. The point is, someone is paying someone. You're getting married, and there is absolutely a receipt involved. These exchanges weren't just about wealth. They were about status, expectations, and public statements. A large dowry might indicate a bride came from a prestigious family. A stingy one might suggest they were trying to offload her quickly, possibly due to suspicious personality traits or a habit of talking back. You, as the bride, didn't usually get to keep your dowry. It became part of the household economy, managed by your husband, guarded by the law, and hopefully not gambled away on dice and ale within the first month of marriage. If the marriage ended, through death, annulment, or your husband wandering off to join a monastery after midlife regret, your dowry could theoretically be returned. But retrieving it was often harder than pulling a sword from a stone. You'd need support, legal backing, and ideally someone who could read. Meanwhile, the bride price, if paid, was like buying a rare goat, expensive up front and no refunds. It compensated the bride's family for the loss of her labour. After all, who's going to milk the sheep now? So while love was occasionally in the mix, money was always at the altar. So you didn't go the marriage route. Maybe you were the second son, or your dowry was suspiciously small, or you just really liked chanting. Either way, you've joined a monastery or convent. Congratulations, you've now taken a vow of poverty, chastity, and an aggressive disinterest in romance. And yet, here you are, in a stone cloister surrounded by silence, candle smoke, and Brother Anselm's unexpectedly soulful eyes. Yes, even behind monastery walls, forbidden love found a way. To be clear, falling in love in a religious order was deeply discouraged. Like, you might get whipped, exiled, or lectured by someone with a Latin name. Discouraged. You've sworn to give your heart entirely to God, which means giving it to literally no one else. But hearts are unruly, and sometimes prayers start sounding a lot like love poems. Maybe it starts with innocent tasks. Passing each other bread in the refectory, whispering during vespers, laughing a little too hard when someone drops a hymnal. Before you know it, you're tucking extra cheese into Sister Beatrice's satchel and questioning everything. Some monks and nuns wrote passionate letters, disguised, of course, as theological musings. "Your soul is a shining light in the darkness of my contemplation" sounds holy, unless you read between the lines. And many did. There were, inevitably, scandals, secret meetings in the herb garden, midnight confessions that weren't strictly sacramental, and the occasional gasp-worthy discovery of a nun with a suspiciously round belly. The punishment, usually harsh: exile, public penance, or being reassigned to some far-off abbey known mostly for sheep and silence. Still, not all stories ended in disgrace. Some lovers escaped. A few even got married after being defrocked. Most, though, returned to their cloisters, red-faced and redevoted, swearing that the whole thing was just an overzealous theological debate. Because in the end, monastic life was about discipline. But humans are humans, even in robes, even in silence. And sometimes a quiet glance across the chapel was more thrilling than any tournament or courtly poem. You did it. You got married. There was a priest, a pig roast, and someone spilled mead on your mother's only nice cloak. But now it's been a few months, or years, and something feels off. Maybe your spouse snores like a dying lute. Maybe they forgot to mention their chronic gambling problem. Or maybe you just realised that marrying for land and sheep doesn't automatically result in romantic bliss. Either way, welcome to the world of medieval marital disappointment. Now, don't go reaching for the divorce papers, because they don't exist. At least, not in any form you'd recognize. Marriage was a sacred and unbreakable bond, approved by the Church, sealed by God, and enforced by public shame. You could try for an annulment, but you'd need a very good reason. We don't get along doesn't cut it. You'd have to prove that one of you was underage, already married, too closely related, which happened disturbingly often, or, best case scenario, never consummated the marriage, which meant someone had to confirm that fact, in writing, possibly under oath. Good luck. If you're a noble, it gets messier. Your marriage wasn't just personal, it was political. Trying to escape it could start a feud, ignite a scandal, or launch a minor war. Best to just quietly resent each other and attend separate feasts. So what do unhappy couples do? Mostly they just endure. You sleep in different beds. You sigh dramatically at dinner. You pour your feelings into embroidery, or that one really angry psalm. Passive aggression becomes your love language. Of course, affairs happened, usually quietly, sometimes spectacularly. Nobles had secret lovers. Peasants had suspiciously helpful neighbours. The Church condemned it, of course, but that didn't stop people. It just made them better at sneaking around barns and blaming things on God's mysterious will. For women, getting out of a bad marriage was especially hard. Even if your husband was violent or vanished, society expected you to stay loyal, silent, and mildly pious while surviving off bread crusts and disapproval. Still, some people made it work. Marriages weren't always happy, but they could become partnerships, forged by hardship, habit, and the shared experience of hauling firewood in the rain. Let's say your spouse dies. Maybe it was the plague. Maybe a farm accident. Maybe they tripped over a goose in the dark. However it happened, you're now widowed. And suddenly, the medieval dating pool opens back up. Being a widow in the Middle Ages was oddly liberating. Not do whatever you want liberating, but certainly more freedom than you had before. For women, especially, widowhood often brought a taste of independence. Managing land, making decisions, even speaking in public without being immediately shushed. And if you were young-ish and still had teeth, you could remarry, quickly, very quickly. Mourning periods existed, but so did survival instincts. A widow with land and no husband was basically a walking treasure chest. Suitors appeared with alarming speed, some sincere, others just very enthusiastic about your dairy cows. If you're a man and recently widowed, society practically pushes you back into marriage. Who else is going to cook, clean, and raise the 11 children you somehow accumulated? So you start looking. Maybe the baker's daughter. Maybe that quiet widow who always brings suspiciously good mead to market. Romance in second marriages could be surprisingly sweet. This time around, you're older, wiser. You're not being pushed into an alliance. You're choosing someone to survive with. Maybe even someone you like. Wild concept. Of course, there were rules. The Church frowned on remarriage that happened too quickly. Like, your spouse isn't cold yet. Quickly. And widows often had to negotiate with family over dowries and inheritance. Nothing says romantic second chance like arguing with your brother-in-law over who keeps the butter churn. But still, second marriages were common, even expected. Life was short, winters were long. No one wanted to spend them alone if they didn't have to. And yes, love was part of it. Maybe not the swooning, sonnet-writing kind, but the quiet kind, based on shared stories, mutual respect, and the understanding that both of you had already seen some things. So you light the fire, pour the soup, and try again. Not because it's perfect, but because it's human. You've made it this far, survived the contracts, the courtships, the chaperones, and possibly a dramatic barn elopement. But before you fall for someone new, ask yourself the most medieval question of all. Are you cosmically allowed to love this person? Because in the Middle Ages, love wasn't just a matter of the heart. It was a matter of stars, bones, and whether or not your grandmother saw a fox this morning. Let's begin with astrology. Yes, before you kissed anyone, you might want to consult the local monk astrologer. Are your signs compatible? Is Venus in retrograde? Was your beloved born under an unlucky moon? If so, better to marry someone less cursed. Love is hard enough without planetary sabotage. Then there were birthmarks, mysterious little symbols that might identify you as your soulmate's long-lost twin, or their destined executioner. Superstitions were flexible like that. But the church had its own checklist. You couldn't marry your cousin, or your second cousin, or your fourth cousin twice removed, unless you had special permission, which the wealthy often bought, because loopholes. So before things got serious, you'd probably need to draw a family tree, and then quietly erase parts of it. Social status also mattered, deeply. A noble could not fall in love with a peasant without it being declared either a miracle or a moral failing. Cross-class romance was rare, scandalous, and only acceptable if it later became a tragic folk song. And then there were the omens. If a raven flew overhead while you were thinking about someone, bad sign. If you dropped bread at dinner while glancing at your crush, forget it. That's a cursed union. Someone might bury a charm under your doorstep to protect you from improper suitors, or to sabotage your chances. Either worked. Love, in this world, wasn't just personal. It was mystical. Everyone had an opinion. The stars, the saints, the weather, and that one woman in the woods who definitely wasn't a witch, except she probably was. But despite all the rules, signs, and whispered warnings, people still loved. Clumsily, bravely, often against advice. Because medieval or not, the heart remains wonderfully disobedient. You've probably heard of Alexander the Great, maybe even Julius Caesar, but have you ever heard of the woman who allegedly chopped off the head of Cyrus the Great and dunked it in blood? Her name was Thamyris, and she didn't rule from a throne gilded in gold or within high-walled cities. No, her court was the open sky, her army was the wind, and her power came not from titles, but from pure, unshakable authority. She was queen of the Massagetæ, a confederation of nomadic tribes who roamed the steppes of Central Asia. Think, horse archers, tattooed warriors, ritual feasts, and battlefield justice. Thamyris didn't inherit her power from a pampered courtier system. She rose through grit, leadership, and possibly a healthy dose of "don't mess with me" energy. Her people were tough, accustomed to harsh winters, long migrations, and enemies on every side. But even among such people, she stood out. She was a warrior, a lawgiver, and a ruler in her own right. No husband overshadowed her. No brother guided her hand. Now, to be clear, much of what we know about Thamyris comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, a man not exactly known for his strict fact-checking. But if even a fraction of his account is true, then Thamyris wasn't just a queen. She was a storm in human form. At the heart of her story is this. A foreign superpower was growing stronger by the day. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, led by Cyrus the Great. He had already conquered Lydia and Babylon, and now his gaze turned east. The Massagetæ were next on his list. But Cyrus didn't fully understand what kind of woman he was dealing with. Before the first arrow flew, before the first spear shattered, and before her son's death changed everything, Thamyris was already preparing for war. Not because she wanted conquest, but because she refused submission. She wasn't just defending territory, she was defending a way of life. And as Cyrus would soon learn, there are some queens you just don't invade. Cyrus the Great had a reputation. He wasn't just any king, he was a conqueror's conqueror. The kind of man who could stroll into ancient cities, topple empires, and still get remembered fondly by historians. So when he looked east toward the land of the Massagetæ, he didn't exactly expect resistance. After all, Who could possibly say no to the man who had taken Babylon without even breaking a sweat? Cyrus sent a polite offer first, because of course, every good imperialist starts with a smile. He proposed a political marriage between himself and Tomyris. Now you might think, that's romantic. But Tomyris saw right through it. She understood that this wasn't about love or even alliance. It was about control. If she married Cyrus, her kingdom would become just another province of the Persian Empire, and she, a trophy queen. She declined, firmly. Cyrus, unaccustomed to rejection, didn't take it well. If he couldn't charm her into submission, he would take her kingdom by force. He crossed the Araxes River, which separated his empire from the lands of the Massagetæ, and established a foothold. But Tomyris wasn't idle. She gathered her warriors, consulted her chiefs, and prepared for what she knew was coming: war. Then came the bait. Cyrus, under the guidance of his general Harpagus, laid a trap. He left a portion of his army behind, with a lavish camp overflowing with wine and food, luxuries that nomads rarely indulged in. Tomyris' son, Spargapizes, led a detachment to investigate. They raided the camp, took the supplies, and fatally drank the wine. The Persians returned at just the right moment. Drunk, disoriented, and unprepared, Spargapizes and his men were overwhelmed. He was captured alive. When Tomyris heard the news, her world cracked. This wasn't just a military loss. It was personal. Her son, her heir, was now a prisoner in Persian hands. She sent a message to Cyrus. "Give me back my son, and leave. If you do not, I swear by the sun, the master of the Massagetæ, I will give you your fill of blood." Cyrus didn't listen. Spargapizes, ashamed of his capture, killed himself in Persian custody. Tomyris had just lost her only son, and now she was out for blood. Grief is a powerful thing. But grief mixed with fury, that's the recipe for absolute devastation. When Tomyris learned her son Spargapizes had taken his own life in Persian captivity, something inside her snapped. This was no longer about borders, pride, or even independence. This was war soaked in vengeance. And Tomyris wasn't one to grieve quietly. She didn't retire to her tent in mourning robes or weep by the fire. No, she mounted her horse, sharpened her weapons, and swore an oath that would echo through history. She would face Cyrus in battle. She would defeat him. And then she would make sure he never forgot her name, even in death. According to Herodotus, Tomyris summoned her tribal council. Under her command, the Massagetæ mobilized. Picture it. Hundreds of warriors on horseback, adorned in leather armor, wielding bows and spears, faces painted with fury. They didn't march like a Persian army. They moved like a storm, swift, chaotic, and with deadly precision. This time, she set the trap. Cyrus, perhaps overconfident from his earlier deception, underestimated her resolve. But Tomyris knew his tactics now. She studied his movements, waited for the right moment, and then unleashed everything. The two armies clashed in what Herodotus describes as one of the bloodiest battles of the ancient world. There were no fancy formations or long speeches, just screaming horses, clashing blades, and a queen who fought alongside her warriors. No silk-robed empress here. Tomyris was in the thick of it, riding hard, cutting down enemies with merciless focus. And when the dust finally settled, Cyrus the Great was dead. Tomyris, ever theatrical in her justice, had his body searched. His head was severed, placed into a wineskin filled with blood, and presented as a final offering. According to Herodotus, she spoke to it. "You thirsted for blood, now drink your fill." Whether or not every detail is true is almost beside the point, because what matters is that Tomyris won. She crushed the most powerful empire of her day, avenged her son, and made sure that her name would be remembered, not as a victim, but as a conqueror. And this was just the start of her legend. The battlefield was silent. The Persians were dead or fleeing. their legendary king lifeless in the dust. And Tomyris? She didn't celebrate like a conqueror. She didn't parade through Persepolis or carve her face into coins. Instead, she stood over Cyrus's body, her vengeance fulfilled, but her heart still broken. Victory, it turned out, didn't bring peace. The Massagetæ had won more than just a battle. They had turned the tide of empire. The death of Cyrus the Great sent shockwaves across the ancient world. In Babylon, Egypt, and the far corners of the Persian realm, rumours swirled. The unstoppable king had fallen, not at the hands of another great empire, but by a nomadic queen who had no throne, no palace, just fury, grit, and a cavalry of warriors who would ride into hell for her. And yet, Tomyris didn't exploit her victory for conquest. She returned to her people with the same pragmatism she ruled with. No war taxes, no imperial ambitions. She didn't try to seize the Persian throne. That wasn't her world. Her justice had been served. Her son had been avenged. The empire could continue without Cyrus, but now it would think twice before ever riding east again. It's worth noting just how rare this was. Most rulers, after winning a battle of that magnitude, would have grabbed power with both hands. But Tomyris seemed more concerned with preserving her people's freedom than expanding her reach. And yet, this is where her story begins to fade. There are no records of her after the battle, no statues, no royal tomb, no Massagetæ monuments carved in stone. She rides into the fog of history, as elusive and untamed as the steppes themselves. Historians debate whether Herodotus exaggerated her tale. Some say Cyrus died elsewhere, that the wineskin of blood was poetic fiction. But even skeptics agree someone dealt Persia a heavy blow. And it wasn't a king, it wasn't a general, it was a queen, a mother, a woman whose love for her son fueled one of the most dramatic reckonings in ancient history. And her story, it didn't need to be written in stone. It was carried by the wind. Because when the wind howls across the steppe, some still say it whispers her name, Tomyris. To understand Tomyris, you have to understand the people she led. The Massagetæ weren't your typical ancient civilization. No marble temples, no hanging gardens, no scrolls of poetry. They were a nomadic warrior culture, living in the vast, untamed lands east of the Caspian Sea, lands too wild for Persian satraps or Babylonian scribes. Their world was one of movement, survival, and honour. Imagine sprawling plains without borders, herds of horses and cattle as currency, and warriors raised in the saddle. Children were taught to ride before they could walk straight. Archery wasn't a sport, it was second nature. Their bows were compact and deadly. Their armour? Layers of leather and scale, flexible for riding, sturdy for war. They hunted, they raided, and they fought to protect their freedom. And unlike many patriarchal societies of the time, Massagetæ women could, and did, fight. That wasn't an exception. It was expected. Warrior women weren't legends. They were your neighbours. So when Tomyris picked up a sword and led her people into battle, no one raised an eyebrow. She wasn't pretending to be a man or defying norms. She was the norm, just sharper, smarter, and far more dangerous than most. Their society valued strength, but also justice. Crimes were punished harshly, but fairly. Property was communal in many ways. What mattered was loyalty to the tribe and the ability to defend it. Kings and queens ruled, yes, but through consensus, not tyranny. Leaders had to prove themselves through deeds, not bloodlines. And as for religion, they were sun worshippers. Tomyris, in her famous warning to Cyrus, swore by the sun, the master of the Massagetæ. The sun was life, light, and justice, the divine judge of all oaths. To break one's word was to spit in the face of the heavens. In short, Tomyris wasn't some anomaly. She was the ideal embodiment of her people. Fierce, principled, proud. She didn't rise to power in spite of being a woman. She rose because she was exactly the kind of leader the Massagetæ revered. While the Persians had bureaucracy, the Massagetae had freedom, and in one brutal, history-defining clash, that freedom held its ground. Because when you come from a land where the wind never stops, and the sky is your only ceiling, submission is simply not an option. You know what's strange? Everything we know about Tomyris, her battle with Cyrus, her son's death, the wineskin full of blood, it all comes from one man, Herodotus. Now, Herodotus is often called the father of history, which sounds great until you realize he's also the father of hearsay, myth, and dramatic flair. The man loved a good story, and if that story involved divine omens, gory revenge, or queens shoving heads into blood, well, even better. So, how much of Tomyris's tale is true? That depends on how much you trust a Greek writing decades after the events, who had probably never met a single Massagetae in his life. Herodotus relied on second-hand accounts, travellers' tales, and whatever rumours were circling the Persian Empire. To him, history wasn't just a record, it was a performance. Still, here's the thing. He chose to tell her story. In a world brimming with male warlords, tyrants, and kings, Herodotus went out of his way to spotlight a steppe queen who brought down one of the greatest rulers in history. That's not nothing. But let's zoom out. Why did this tale spread so widely? Simple. It had everything. A noble woman, a tragic son, a cunning enemy, a battle to the death, a gory finale worthy of any Greek tragedy. If you were living in Athens or Thebes and heard this tale from a travelling bard, you'd remember Tomyris forever, not because she wore a crown, but because she dared to defy a superpower, and won. And over time, her story morphed. Medieval chronicles painted her as a savage Amazon. Renaissance artists depicted her drenched in blood, holding Cyrus's head like a trophy. She was exotic, fearsome, iconic. Yet through all the retellings, something real clings to her legend. Maybe not the exact dialogue, maybe not the wineskin, but the bones of the story, the queen, the son, the war, the victory, feel too specific, too human, to be pure invention. In the end, Herodotus didn't just preserve Tomyris, he mythologized her. And while that may blur the lines between fact and fiction, it also ensured that her name would live far longer than Cyrus's imperial edicts. Because history forgets generals, but it remembers vengeance. For a queen with no surviving monuments, Tomyris has haunted the imagination of empires for over 2,000 years. Renaissance painters adored her. She was a dramatic muse, perfect for the bloody climax of a canvas. In 1622, Rubens painted her calmly holding a severed head, while courtiers looked on in awe. In another, she stands regal and composed, while Cyrus's decapitated head is ceremonially dunked into a golden vessel brimming with blood. Tasteful? Maybe not. Memorable? Absolutely. To European artists, Tomyris wasn't just a historical figure. She was symbolism incarnate. A woman who punished pride, a savage noble, a cautionary tale. A feminist icon, depending on who was holding the brush. She could represent the righteous fury of a mother, the barbarism of the East, or the wisdom of a ruler who refused to be bought. Writers loved her too. In the 18th and 19th centuries, she appeared in plays, novels, and philosophical tracts. Enlightenment thinkers debated whether she was proof that women could govern wisely, or a reminder of what happens when emotions rule leadership. Either way, she stayed in print. But oddly enough, her own people left no records. The Massagetae faded from history, absorbed or erased by later nomadic cultures. No carved inscriptions, no burial mounds with gold plaques saying Tomyris was here. Her memory survived entirely through outsiders' eyes, and yet she kept reappearing. In Soviet-era Central Asia, Tomyris was reclaimed as a symbol of resistance against imperialism. Statues of her were erected in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. Modern scholars re-evaluated her not as a bloodthirsty barbarian, but as a legitimate head of state, a woman who ruled, led armies, and negotiated from a position of strength. She has appeared in everything from documentaries to video games. In one moment, she's a playable leader in a strategy game. In the next, she's being analysed in academic journals on gender and power. That's range. And here's the strange part. We still don't even know what she looked like. No coins, no busts, no carvings. But we know what she stood for. Strength, vengeance, autonomy, legacy. In a world that forgets queens who behave, Tomyris is remembered because she did not. She didn't ask to be part of history's art gallery. She kicked the door down and posed for the bloodiest portrait ever painted. Tomyris wasn't the first woman to lead warriors into battle, and she certainly wasn't the last. But history tends to treat women like her as exceptions, isolated flashes of power in a man's world. The truth? Tomyris was part of a long, often overlooked lineage of women who ruled through the sword. Let's rewind a bit. Before Tomyris, there was Shamuramat, the Assyrian queen who may have inspired the mythical Semiramis, builder of cities, slayer of rebels. Around the same era, the Scythians, cultural cousins of the Massagetae, had female warriors buried with weapons, their skeletons showing clear signs of battle injuries. These weren't ceremonial roles. These women fought, bled, and died on horseback, and after Tomyris came more. Boudica, the Celtic queen who led a fiery revolt against the Roman Empire in the 1st century CE, is often compared to her. Like Tomyris, Boudica's war was sparked by personal loss. Her daughters were assaulted, her land seized. Her response? She burned Roman settlements to ash. The parallels are uncanny. Grief, vengeance, and an empire too arrogant to see what was coming. There's also Zenobia, queen of Palmyra, who in the 3rd century CE defied Rome itself and carved out her own mini-empire in the east. She minted coins with her face. She declared independence. She made the emperor come to her. What binds all these women together, Tomyris included, isn't just power. It's audacity. They led in eras that pretended leadership belonged to men. They wielded authority not as caretakers or stand-ins, but as strategists, generals and rulers. And while many male leaders were praised for their conquests, these women were often labelled dangerous, unnatural, savage. Why? Because they won. Tomyris wasn't an outlier. She was part of a global, centuries-long pattern of women who rose in times of crisis and made kings bleed. Her story, preserved by Greek pens and modern imagination, reminds us that female leadership wasn't rare. It was just rarely recorded. So when you picture ancient warfare, don't just see helmets and beards. See a queen on horseback, bow in hand, blood in her eyes, and understand, Tomyris wasn't alone. She was just one of the few they couldn't erase. Tomyris never built a palace. She didn't leave behind golden inscriptions or dynastic walls. There's no great tomb, no preserved armour, no marble bust in a museum. And yet, she endures. In many ways, her legacy is a paradox. Her entire story hinges on a handful of paragraphs from Herodotus, biased, embellished, possibly fictional. But those words planted a seed that refused to die. For over 2 millennia, her name has resurfaced, again and again, in times when the world needed to remember that power doesn't always wear a crown, or a beard. She's been reimagined through so many lenses. To Renaissance Europe, she was the noble savage, a warning to tyrants. To modern Central Asia, she became a folk hero, a symbol of resistance and national pride, especially in countries still reckoning with colonial and imperial pasts. Statues of her rise from plazas in Kazakhstan. Children learn her name in school books. Politicians quote her when invoking strength and independence. But beyond symbolism and myth, there's something undeniably human about her story. It's about a mother who lost her son. It's about a leader forced to choose between surrender and survival. It's about a person who, when cornered by one of the greatest powers the world had ever seen, chose to fight, and won. In a world that often erases the names of warrior women, Tomyris persists like a blade buried just beneath the surface, always ready to be unearthed by a new generation hungry for stories of untamed defiance. She reminds us that history isn't just kings and empires. It's also mothers and queens, grief and revenge, dirt and blood. It's the silent moments after battle, when a woman stands alone in a field littered with corpses, knowing she has changed the course of the world, but will never be fully believed. And that might be her greatest legacy, the refusal to be forgotten. No statues, no problem. Her name still rides on the wind of the steppes. Her story still makes emperors look mortal. And her legend still whispers the warning, "Come for me, and you'll drink your fill of blood." So the next time you hear of a great king's downfall, remember, sometimes the final blow comes not from a rival empire, but from a queen on horseback, lost to history, but never truly gone. Imagine a life where your walls are made of felt, your roof is stitched from hide, and your front door opens to the horizon. There are no cities, no farmland, no stone monuments to pass on to the future, just the rhythm of hooves, the whisper of grass, and the ever-changing sky. For ancient nomadic cultures, permanence was a myth, and mobility was strength. From the Eurasian steppes to the Arabian deserts, ancient nomads shaped entire civilizations without leaving a single marble temple. These weren't rootless wanderers. They were strategic movers, guided by the seasons, the grazing patterns of their herds, and an intimate understanding of terrain. Their homes were yurts, tents, or wheeled wagons, foldable fortresses designed for life on the move. Cattle, sheep, goats, and most of all horses were the pillars of nomadic life. A person's wealth was counted in livestock, not land. Horses were more than tools. They were companions, weapons, and status symbols. To ride well was to survive. To ride best was to rule. But being mobile didn't mean being disorganized. Nomadic societies had complex social structures. Power usually flowed through clans and tribes, with leadership often based on merit and influence rather than strict heredity. A chief or khan might rise through tactical brilliance, oratory skill, or sheer charisma. Loyalty was personal, earned in campfire councils and on wind-scoured battlefields. And far from being isolated from the world, nomads were its connective tissue. They moved silk from China, spices from India, silver from Persia, and slaves from Europe. Nomadic caravans and traders were the original transcontinental couriers, long before empires caught on. And when trade broke down, they raided, swift, strategic, and terrifyingly efficient. Their history wasn't written in stone. It was sung, recited, and remembered. Elders passed down legends and laws through oral tradition. A tribe's entire legal system, history, and identity could be carried in the mind of a single bard or elder. Stories weren't entertainment. They were instruction, governance, and identity. In the eyes of empires, nomads were unpredictable, alien, and dangerous. But to themselves, they were guardians of freedom, masters of adaptation, and heirs to the wind. They left few ruins behind, but they reshaped the world every time they rode. Long before the Mongols thundered across Eurasia, the Scythians ruled the wind-swept steppe. Between the 9th and 2nd centuries BCE, these nomadic warriors dominated the lands stretching from the Black Sea to the edges of Central Asia. To the Greeks, they were fearsome horsemen and exotic barbarians. To themselves, they were a people of freedom, vengeance, and pride. Scythian society was built around mobility and violence. Their horse culture was unmatched. Boys learned to ride before they could walk properly. Their weapons were practical and deadly. Short composite bows, ideal for shooting while galloping at full speed, curved swords, battle axes, and iron-tipped spears. The Scythian warrior wasn't just a man either. Archaeological finds confirm what Herodotus hinted at. Women fought too. Some graves reveal female skeletons buried with weapons, showing battle wounds that only came from real combat. They didn't build cities, but their kurgans, burial mounds, have preserved their legacy. Beneath these mounds, archaeologists have found gold, intricate tattoos on preserved skin, embroidered garments, and elaborate weaponry. Their art style, full of swirling animals and predatory symbolism, reflects a life bound to nature and the hunt. But the Scythians weren't just wild raiders. They were diplomats, mercenaries, and traders, especially with Greek colonies along the Black Sea. They sold furs, slaves, and grain, and in return imported wine, pottery, and luxury goods. Greek writers both admired and feared them. Herodotus wrote of their strange customs, like drinking the blood of enemies or using scalps as napkins. But he also praised their justice and loyalty to kin. Their religion was primal and animistic. They worshipped gods of war, fire, and fertility. Some rituals involved cannabis smoke, others horse sacrifice. Their worldview was cyclical and tied to the land, not in terms of ownership, but sacred movement. Eventually, they faded. Pressured by other nomadic groups like the Sarmatians, and boxed in by growing empires, the Scythians dissolved into history. But they set the standard for the steppe warrior archetype. A mobile, deadly, fiercely independent fighter with no master and no fixed home. They didn't write books. But when you see a mounted archer silhouetted against the steppe, that shadow is Scythian. They were the storm before the empire. While the Scythians ruled the grasslands, the Bedouins carved their legacy into sand. Originating in the vast deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, the Bedouin were not merely wanderers. They were engineers of survival, mastering some of the most inhospitable terrain on earth. Unlike the mounted thunder of steppe nomads, the Bedouin life was quieter, more deliberate. It was built around the rhythms of the desert, drought and rainfall, grazing routes, and the movements of stars. Their home was the black goat hair tent, or Beit el-Sha'ar, portable, breathable, and easy to pack. Life moved with the camels, known as the ships of the desert. Camels were transport, food, clothing, and currency all at once. The Bedouin were famed for their tribal structure. Everything revolved around the clan. Loyalty to kin came before all else. Honour, or sharaf, wasn't just a word. It was the social glue. A single insult could start a blood feud. But generosity to guests, karam, was just as sacred. A stranger could expect food, water, and protection for 3 days. No questions asked. Their warfare was rooted in the raid, or gazu, fast, strategic attacks designed to capture goods and livestock without unnecessary bloodshed. Battle wasn't about mass slaughter. It was about survival, prestige, and honour. A successful raid elevated a man's status. A failed one could stain a tribe's reputation for generations. But Bedouin life wasn't all conflict and sandstorms. It was rich in oral tradition. Poets were warriors of words. Their verses preserved history, shamed enemies, and praised heroes. Poetry was passed from memory to memory, often performed in song-like cadence around the fire. Some poems became tribal lore, others became legacy. Trade caravans also passed through Bedouin lands. These tribesmen served as guides, protectors, and sometimes smugglers, moving goods like incense, spices, and silk from southern Arabia to the Levant and beyond. They knew every oasis, every star path. Their knowledge was legendary and expensive. Though many Bedouins later integrated into cities and empires, they maintained a fierce sense of identity. Even today, the black tent and tribal codes remain symbols of Bedouin pride. They weren't just survivors of the desert, they were its soul. No nomadic people have ever reshaped the world quite like the Mongols. In the 13th century, these steppe riders erupted out of the plains of Mongolia and carved out the largest contiguous land empire in history. But their roots were no different than the other nomadic cultures they followed: mobile, clan-based, and fiercely adaptive. Life on the Mongolian steppe was brutal and demanding. The Mongols lived in gurs, circular felt tents that could be assembled in under an hour and packed onto a cart the next morning. Their herds, horses, yaks, goats, sustained them, and their children were raised in the saddle. Riding was a skill learned before literacy. In fact, most Mongols couldn't read, but they didn't need to. Their knowledge was encoded in songs, proverbs, and memory. What made the Mongols different was how they weaponized mobility. Under Genghis Khan, tribal divisions were shattered and reorganized into a new merit-based system. Loyalty to tribe was replaced by loyalty to the Khan, and with that, the world changed. Mongol warfare was a ballet of speed and deception. Their horse archers could fire accurately at full gallop, fake retreats to lure enemies and travel over 100 miles a day. But they weren't just raiders, they were strategists. They used scouts, spies, signal flags, and psychological warfare with terrifying precision. Once they began conquering cities, they adapted quickly. Siege engineers from China and Persia joined their ranks. The Mongols learned how to build catapults, flaming arrows, and battering rams, and used them with chilling efficiency. But here's the twist. They weren't just destroyers. The Mongol Empire connected the world in ways never seen before. They revived and protected the Silk Road, ensuring safe passage from China to Europe. Goods, ideas, and even diseases like the Black Death travelled their vast network. They introduced paper currency, passport systems, and religious tolerance across their realm. A Muslim merchant, a Christian priest, and a Buddhist monk could all travel safely under Mongol rule, as long as they didn't rebel. And yet, they remained nomads at heart. Even as they governed empires, Mongol rulers still returned to their tents, their herds, and the open steppe. They conquered cities, but never truly belonged to them, because no matter how high they climbed, they always rode with the wind at their backs. To the sedentary empires, nomads were either useful or dangerous, and sometimes both at the same time. But to nomads, the line between trade and raid was negotiable. One day, they'd escort your caravans across the desert. The next, they'd plunder your border towns. It all depended on the mood, the season, and how well you paid. Trade was vital to nomadic life. Most nomads couldn't grow grain or make pottery. They needed tools, textiles, spices, and luxury goods. In exchange, they offered livestock, furs, leather, salt, and exotic items like falcons or rare horses. Some traded directly with empires. Others operated as middlemen between distant regions, forming crucial links along the Silk Road, incense route, and other transcontinental paths. But these weren't simple merchant caravans. They were armed convoys, ready to defend themselves or attack, depending on the situation. A tribal leader might negotiate with a border governor one week, then raid his storehouses the next. Empires called this treachery. Nomads called it options. The Scythians, for example, traded grain and gold to Greek cities along the Black Sea, but if a city tried to cheat them, they burned it. The Bedouins protected incense and spice caravans across Arabia. Unless someone failed to pay protection fees, then the camels changed direction. The Mongols under Genghis Khan initially tried peaceful trade with the Khwarezmian Empire, but when their merchants were executed, they responded by annihilating entire cities. To the nomadic mind, trade was personal and political. It wasn't just business, it was a reflection of respect. If a sedentary kingdom treated the nomads as equals, commerce thrived. If they disrespected them, the punishment was swift, and usually on horseback. This tension gave rise to a strange relationship. Border economies. Towns and cities on the edge of nomadic zones often became hybrid spaces, half military outpost, half market. Governors bribed chieftains, tribes traded news, horses, and intelligence. Sometimes marriages were arranged to seal fragile peace. This dance between trade and raid wasn't a flaw in nomadic life. It was a feature. It allowed them to negotiate power without occupying territory, to influence empires without building them, and to remain fluid in a world that worshipped walls. They didn't need to conquer cities. They just needed cities to keep watching the horizon. In a world without libraries, scrolls, or printing presses, how do you preserve your history? For nomadic cultures, the answer was simple and incredibly powerful. You remember it. Oral tradition wasn't just a storytelling tool for ancient nomads. It was their library, courtroom, constitution, and mythos, all rolled into one. From the Scythian grasslands to the Mongol plains and the Bedouin deserts, memory was sacred, and the tongue was sharper than the sword. Elders were more than old men and women. They were archives in human form. They knew lineages stretching back a dozen generations, war stories that shaped tribal identity, and proverbs that guided decisions in peace and battle alike. These weren't campfire tales told for amusement. These were lessons, warnings, and laws. Among the Bedouins, poetry was king. A well-crafted verse could shame an enemy, honour a fallen warrior, or settle a dispute. Poets, or sha'ir, were advisors to tribal leaders, remembered more clearly than many chiefs. Their words could ignite war or stop it cold, and their memory? Flawless. Entire epics were passed down word for word, generation after generation. The Mongols were no different. The great work known as The Secret History of the Mongols was first preserved orally, only written down later. It tells not just the rise of Genghis Khan, but the cultural values of loyalty, fate, revenge, and ambition that defined their world. It isn't a dry historical record. It's a living saga, originally recited by heart to teach and unify. Even the Scythians, who left almost no written records, maintained detailed oral accounts of their migrations, battles, and alliances. When Greek writers like Herodotus described their tales, they were capturing echoes of a far older spoken tradition. History passed through campfires, not chiselled in stone. Oral tradition had its risks. Memories faded, stories evolved. But it also had one massive advantage. It lived. It was adaptable, flexible, and deeply human. It allowed nomadic societies to retain identity even after migrations, defeats, or cultural absorption. Empires may have fallen and their archives turned to dust, but nomadic stories survived, not because they were written down, but because they were woven into breath. And as long as someone remembered, nothing was truly lost. In many ancient civilizations, women were confined to the background, silent, veiled, or confined behind palace walls. But in nomadic societies, the story was often very different. On the move, everyone worked, and that meant women held power too. From the Scythians to the Mongols, archaeological and historical evidence shows that nomadic women were not just mothers and wives. They were riders, warriors, shamans, diplomats, and clan leaders. Life on the move didn't allow for idle hands. Every member of the community, regardless of gender, had to contribute to survival, warfare, and governance. Take the Scythians, for example. Burial sites across the Eurasian steppe have revealed women buried with swords, arrows, and armour, their bones showing injuries from combat. These weren't symbolic burials. These women fought. Greek historians were so intrigued and terrified that they crafted entire myths about Amazons, fierce warrior women supposedly descended from these nomadic tribes. In Mongol society, women managed the encampments while the men were away raiding or conquering. But even at the highest levels of power, women left their mark. Genghis Khan's daughters and daughters-in-law often ruled territories, led armies, and conducted diplomacy. One of the most powerful women in Mongol history, Sorghaghtani Beki, was a strategist and kingmaker who raised emperors and brokered alliances. Among the Bedouins, women had fewer public leadership roles, but still wielded influence through poetry, family alliances, and the sacred traditions of hospitality. A woman's tent was her domain. Her ability to manage resources, uphold honour, and raise future warriors made her a central figure in tribal life. In some tribes, women could initiate divorce, control property, and even own camels, the ultimate symbol of wealth and survival. Religion also gave nomadic women spiritual authority. In various Turkic and Siberian steppe cultures, Female shamans played crucial roles as healers, spirit guides, and keepers of ancestral wisdom. They weren't fringe mystics. They were respected pillars of the community. In short, mobility created necessity, and necessity gave rise to equality, at least more than what was seen in most empires of the time. The unpredictable nature of nomadic life demanded flexibility. If a man fell in battle, a woman stepped up, without ceremony, without asking permission. In these windswept societies, a woman could be the hand that rocked the cradle and the hand that drew the bow. For nomadic peoples, spirituality was not tied to temples or sacred buildings. It was woven into the land, the sky, and the journey itself. When your life is in constant motion, your gods ride with you. Nomadic belief systems were typically animistic and nature-based, rooted in the cycles of the seasons, the behavior of animals, and the rhythms of survival. The wind wasn't just weather, it was a messenger. Mountains were guardians, rivers carried spirits, fire was sacred, life was a dialogue with the unseen. Among the Scythians, described by Herodotus, worship centered on a pantheon of gods tied to the natural world. Tabete, the goddess of the hearth, likely equivalent to Hestia, and Papaios, the sky god. Rituals often involved horse sacrifice, cannabis smoke, and sacred oaths sworn under open skies. Their spiritual world was visceral, earthy, and direct. No priests in robes, just warriors and shamans calling to the heavens. The Bedouins, before the rise of Islam, practiced a form of polytheism centered around local deities and tribal idols. But above all, they revered the unseen, the mysterious forces of fate and nature. Jinn, or spirits, were believed to dwell in rocks, windstorms, and lonely places. Poets and seers were thought to be inspired, sometimes even possessed, by these entities. Hospitality wasn't just a custom, it was a spiritual obligation. In Mongol culture, the spiritual world was structured around Tengrism, the worship of Tengri, the eternal blue sky. Tengri wasn't a god you prayed to in a temple. He was the sky itself, ever present, watching and judging. Genghis Khan claimed his right to rule came from Tengri. Mongols also revered earth spirits, ancestral ghosts, and the sacred fire in the center of every tent. Shamanism played a vital role. Shamans were healers, spirit guides, and political advisors. The beauty of nomadic spirituality was its adaptability. As nomads came into contact with Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and others, they often blended these beliefs with their own. Mongol emperors patronized multiple religions at once. A Bedouin could follow Islamic law while still clinging to older, desert-rooted customs. Whereas cities built temples to contain the divine, nomads carried the sacred with them. Their gods moved, their rituals adapted, and their beliefs flowed like the rivers they crossed. Because to a nomad, faith didn't need four walls, just sky above, earth below, and memory in between. They didn't leave behind pyramids or cathedrals. You won't find their capitals on modern maps. And yet, the legacy of ancient nomadic cultures is written all over history, in the flow of trade, the scars of conquest, and even the languages we speak. Nomads were not historical footnotes. They were architects of disruption, reshaping entire continents through movement. The Silk Road? That wasn't just a route for silk and spices. It was a highway built by hooves, maintained by the diplomacy, muscle, and local knowledge of nomadic tribes. Without them, East and West might never have met. Empires feared them, and for good reason. The Scythians, Xiongnu, Turks, and Mongols all challenged the myth of urban superiority. Their victories exposed a fundamental truth. Mobility can outthink monuments. Where empires moved slowly, nomads adapted. When cities relied on walls, nomads relied on speed. But their influence wasn't only military. They acted as cultural bridges, carrying music, recipes, stories, and even religion from one world to another. Mongol rule brought Chinese printing technology to Persia. Arab Bedouin traditions shaped the early Islamic world, from language and law to poetry and honor codes. Turkic nomads laid the groundwork for the Ottoman Empire. The paths they rode became arteries of civilization. Even after their empires faded, their spirit endured. You can see it in modern horsemanship, in oral storytelling cultures, and in the values of kinship, resilience, and independence that still echo across the steppe, desert, and tundra. In many ways, they also serve as a warning. They remind us that no structure is permanent, not even the grandest empire. They proved that the wind could erase borders, and that power didn't need to be carved in stone to be real. Today, many nomadic peoples still exist, though fewer in number and often under pressure from modern borders, climate change, and urbanization. Yet their descendants carry traditions older than most nations: hospitality to strangers, reverence for animals, and stories that ride through generations like horses through fog. So when you study history, don't just look at the walls, the temples, the thrones. Look between them. That's where the nomads lived, and that's where history moved. In the mid-1800s, America was a country divided, not just by politics, but by terrain. The East bustled with cities, factories, and ports. The West was a wild expanse of mountains, deserts, and goldfields, and between them stretched over 1,700 miles of unforgiving wilderness. To journey from New York to California meant weeks on a ship around Cape Horn, or months in a wagon, dodging disease, bandits, and dust. But the dream was there, a railroad that would tie the country together, steel rail by steel rail, a direct line from coast to coast, unthinkable to some, inevitable to others. Visionaries believed it could unite the Republic, speed up communication, move armies, open new markets, and settle the untamed frontier. To build it, however, would require more than ambition. It would take money, labour, land, and political power. That last part came with the Civil War. In 1862, while the nation was tearing itself apart, Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act. The law authorized two railroad companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, to start building from opposite ends of the country. The Union Pacific would head west from Omaha, Nebraska. The Central Pacific would go east from Sacramento, California. They would meet in the middle. To fuel the construction, the government offered massive land grants. For every mile of track laid, each company received up to 640 acres of public land and generous loans. The race was on, not just to unite the country, but to claim land, money, and history itself. On paper, it was a marvel of infrastructure. In reality, it was about to become one of the most grueling construction efforts in American history. Workers would blast through mountains, bridge vast plains, and brave bitter winters and scorching deserts. Thousands of immigrants and labourers would be brought in to do the work. The rewards would be monumental, but so would the human cost. And for the indigenous nations living on the land where the tracks would cut through like a scar, this was not progress. It was a warning. In 1862, the idea still sounded like a gamble, but within 7 years, two lines would meet in the Utah desert and change America forever. While the Union Pacific had the flat plains of Nebraska ahead of them, the Central Pacific faced a far more brutal challenge from the very start: the Sierra Nevada mountains. These weren't gentle hills. They were towering granite peaks, prone to avalanches, snowdrifts, and back-breaking terrain. And this was before dynamite was even invented. Construction began in Sacramento in 1863, but the real wall stood just 80 miles east. The Sierras were a formidable barricade, and every mile of track laid felt like a war against nature itself. To conquer this obstacle, the Central Pacific needed labour, a lot of it. At first, they hired mostly Irish immigrants and white labourers, but many quit, unable or unwilling to face the grueling conditions. That's when the company turned to a new workforce: Chinese immigrants. By 1865, over 10,000 Chinese labourers were building the railroad, more than 80% of the Central Pacific's entire workforce. They were paid less than white workers, often lived in more dangerous conditions, and faced deep racism, but they proved indispensable, showing incredible skill, endurance, and discipline. Their work was heroic and horrific. They carved tunnels through solid rock using only hand tools and black powder. The most infamous, Tunnel Number 6, took nearly 2 years to complete. In winter, snowdrifts reached 40 feet. Workers lived in camps buried beneath snow, connected by vertical shafts like chimneys. Dozens died in avalanches, explosions, and rock slides. And yet, the line advanced. To speed progress, Chinese crews suspended themselves in baskets over cliffs, chipping away at stone inch by inch. When they couldn't go around a mountain, they went through it. When they couldn't level terrain, they built wooden trestles that soared above ravines. It was some of the most dangerous and underappreciated labor in American history. Few records exist of individual Chinese workers. No statues were built for them at the time. But without their hands, the transcontinental dream would have died in the Sierras. By 1867, the Central Pacific finally emerged from the mountains. What lay ahead was desert, harsh, dry, and deadly, but flat. The worst was behind them. The race to the meeting point was truly on. While the Central Pacific was battling granite and snow in the west, the Union Pacific had its own gauntlet to run. Starting from Omaha, Nebraska, the company laid track westward through the Great Plains, a land that seemed endless, flat, and deceptively simple. But the challenge wasn't the geography. It was people, politics, and power. The Union Pacific hired largely Irish immigrants, former Union soldiers, and freedmen. Many were veterans looking for steady pay after the Civil War. Crews could lay 2, sometimes even 3 miles of track in a single day. The wide-open plains allowed speed, but they also exposed the workers to raids, starvation, and environmental extremes. This was indigenous land. The Pawnee, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota Sioux had hunted, lived, and died on these plains for generations. And to them, the railroad was not progress. It was an invasion. The track cut directly through tribal hunting grounds. The smoke-belching engines frightened buffalo herds. Telegraph poles and surveyors disrupted sacred spaces. Tribes saw what was coming. Settlers, soldiers, fences, and displacement. Resistance was inevitable. The Lakota Sioux, under leaders like Red Cloud, fought back fiercely. They raided camps, attacked surveying teams, and tore up rails. In response, the US government built forts along the route and stationed troops to guard the track. Railroad construction became a militarized operation, with track layers working under the protection of armed guards. It was a low-grade war, fought with rifles and treaties that never lasted. For the indigenous nations, the railroad represented a death sentence for their way of life. And they were right. Still, the Union Pacific pushed forward. Financially backed by massive federal loans and led by men like Thomas Durant, the company laid track at breakneck speed. Crews lived in temporary towns, dubbed Hell on Wheels, which sprang up overnight and disappeared just as fast. Gambling, whiskey, and violence followed the workers like a dust storm. By 1867, Union Pacific had reached Cheyenne and was headed into Wyoming. The mountains loomed in the distance, but the real mountain they were climbing was political. How do you unite a nation when you're laying rails over the bones of another? For the Union Pacific, the answer was simple. Lay the track. Don't look back. The story of the Transcontinental Railroad is often told with golden spikes and great men in top hats. But the real story? It's soaked in sweat, muscle, and pain. Much of it provided by men whose names were never recorded, whose graves were never marked, and whose stories were buried beneath the tracks they built. On the Central Pacific, it was the Chinese laborers who did the impossible. Nearly 15,000 of them, most hailing from Guangdong province, endured freezing temperatures, deadly explosions, and racial hostility while tunneling through the Sierra Nevada. They earned less than white workers, received no recognition, and were often housed in separate, inferior camps. But they persisted. quietly, skillfully, and relentlessly. Despite being called weak and unfit by early skeptics, the Chinese crews soon proved to be the most reliable workforce on the railroad. They blasted rock, laid rail, built trestles, and cooked their own food, often staying healthier than their counterparts. Yet, when the last spike was driven at Promontory Point, none of them were invited to the celebration photo. Meanwhile, on the Union Pacific, Irish immigrants made up a large portion of the workforce. Many had survived famine and war, only to face new dangers on the plains. They fought off raids, laid track at incredible speed, and drank themselves to sleep in rickety tents. Their lives were hard, but their labour was essential. Former enslaved African Americans also worked the rails, some hired as freedmen seeking better lives. Their contributions, like those of the Chinese and Irish, went largely uncredited. Labourers of colour were exploited, but indispensable. This was a multinational workforce, building a nation with bare hands and broken backs. And then there were the cooks, blacksmiths, teamsters, and supply haulers, each playing a role in keeping the great machine of progress moving forward. None of them were executives, but without them, there'd be no golden spike. In the grand American myth, we tend to spotlight the visionaries and tycoons. But railroads weren't laid by dreams alone. They were laid by calloused hands, underpaid men, and marginalized workers, people who bent history with no guarantee they'd be remembered. They didn't build the railroad for glory. They built it to survive. By the late 1860s, the two railroad companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, were no longer just building tracks. They were locked in a frenzied competition, each racing toward an invisible meeting point somewhere in the Utah Territory. But this wasn't a gentleman's agreement. It was a war for land, money, and prestige. Why the urgency? Because of the way the government subsidies worked. For every mile of track completed, each company received federal land grants and hefty loans. The more track you built, the more profit you claimed. So naturally, both sides tried to outbuild the other, even laying parallel tracks in opposite directions, knowing full well that only one set would be used. It became absurd. Crews worked at breakneck speed. The Central Pacific, fresh off their victory over the Sierra Nevada, now blasted through the Nevada and Utah deserts. Meanwhile, the Union Pacific crossed rivers and high plains, skirting the edge of the Rocky Mountains. They even began laying track through areas they knew the government would eventually declare wasteful, just to secure funding. Work intensified to near manic levels. The Central Pacific's Chinese crews set a world record in April 1869. 10 miles of track laid in a single day, a feat unmatched even today. They accomplished this using synchronized teams, rotating shifts, and a rhythm honed through years of labour. Union Pacific crews, not to be outdone, pushed hard from the east, despite ongoing labour strikes, supply issues, and mismanagement from their financier, Thomas Durant, who was more interested in stock manipulation than railroad engineering. The two tracks finally neared each other at Promontory Summit in present-day Utah. Surveyors marked the site. Arrangements were made for a formal ceremony. Locomotives from both companies, Central Pacific's Jupiter and Union Pacific's No. 119, were brought face-to-face, cowcatcher to cowcatcher. Executives prepared speeches. A special golden spike was commissioned. Telegraph wires were hooked up to transmit the final hammer blows in real time across the country. But behind the celebration was the lingering reality. The race had been brutal, often reckless, and entirely driven by profit. The rails were now joined, but the scars they left behind, on land, labour, and lives, would remain for generations. Progress had a finish line, and both companies were willing to trample over anything to cross it. On May 10th, 1869, the windswept plains of Promontory Summit, Utah, became the centre of the American universe. A crowd of workers, officials, journalists, and railroad executives gathered to witness the momentous event, the joining of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Two gleaming locomotives stood nose to nose on the finished track, the Central Pacific's Jupiter and the Union Pacific's number 119. Between them lay a final rail, and at its centre, a golden spike, engraved with the words, "May God continue the unity of our country as this railroad unites the two great oceans of the world." Telegraph lines had been connected to the ceremonial hammer. Each blow would send an electric signal across the country. As Leland Stanford, representing the Central Pacific, raised the sledgehammer, Americans across the nation leaned in to listen. With each swing, the telegraph clicked. Done. Church bells rang, cannons fired, cities erupted in celebration. From New York to San Francisco, it was as if a national artery had been stitched together in real time. The East and West were no longer months apart. They were 7 days apart by rail. It was a stunning engineering achievement. The United States was now bound coast to coast by steel and steam. The symbolic significance couldn't be overstated. A young, post-Civil War nation had proven it could connect its fractured parts and march into a modern industrial era. But not everyone was part of the celebration. None of the Chinese workers who had laid most of the Central Pacific's track were invited to the photo. They had been excluded from the ceremony entirely, despite their role in accomplishing the impossible. The Irish labourers, freedmen, native guides, and other marginalised workers were also absent from the frame. In their place stood bearded men in frock coats, holding hammers and cigars. So while the country celebrated unity, the reality was more complex. The railroad did connect east to west, but it also sharpened divisions between races, classes, and cultures. It united markets, but at the cost of many human lives. The photo that day captured the official story of the railroad. But the real story? That was buried beneath the track. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad didn't just shrink geography, it exploded the American economy. Almost overnight, the United States was no longer a bi-coastal nation awkwardly bridged by wilderness. It was now a single economic organism, pulsing with movement, commerce, and opportunity. Goods that once took months to transport by wagon or ship could now move from coast to coast in under a week. Agricultural products from the Midwest, wheat, corn, cattle, could be shipped westward to booming mining towns or eastward to the industrial cities. Manufactured goods flowed in the opposite direction. Rail cars replaced oxen. Steam replaced sail. What had once been an uncertain frontier was now a profitable supply chain. Towns sprouted like weeds along the railroad towns that grew up almost overnight. Some became cities. Others disappeared as quickly as they came, especially if the rail line shifted. But each one was a node in a growing network, connected by a steady rhythm of pistons, whistles, and smoke. The railroad also helped fuel industrial growth. Ironworks, coal mines, timber mills all surged with demand. The need for rails, locomotives, and infrastructure created jobs across the nation. Steel barons and railroad tycoons got rich, bankers lined their pockets, and small-time entrepreneurs rode the wave, opening hotels, restaurants, and general stores along the line. Mail moved faster. News travelled across time zones in days instead of weeks. For the first time, the government could project real presence across the full continent, deploying troops, resources, and political influence wherever the rails reached. And let's not forget the human factor. Millions of people moved west. Immigrants from Europe who once landed in New York now saw a direct path to land and labor in California, Oregon, and the Western Territories. Homesteaders, prospectors, ranchers, and outlaws all rode the same steel road toward destiny. Of course, this boom wasn't evenly shared. Wealth flowed upward. Native lands were devoured. Labourers remained poor. But there's no denying it. The railroad transformed the US from a regional republic into a continental power. The engine wasn't just moving people, it was moving money, power, and the future. And once it started, it wasn't going to stop. Beneath the polished steel and triumphant headlines of the Transcontinental Railroad lay a darker, more tragic legacy: the destruction of indigenous lands, lives, and cultures. The railroad didn't just connect east and west, it sliced through native homelands, carving out routes through territories held by the Lakota, Cheyenne, Shoshone, Ute, and many others. What had once been open plains and sacred ground was now divided by rails, telegraph poles, and fencing. With each spike driven, native sovereignty was eroded. The impact was immediate and brutal. Buffalo herds, central to plains tribes' economies, diets, and spirituality, were slaughtered en masse to clear the way for trains and settlers. In some cases, passengers were encouraged to shoot buffalo for sport from moving trains. These herds, once numbering in the tens of millions, dwindled to near extinction in just a few decades. The railroad brought more than tracks. It brought settlers, soldiers, and surveyors. Towns popped up where there had been none. Homesteaders, empowered by the federal government, staked claims on tribal lands. What treaties hadn't taken, the railroad now absorbed. And with settlers came enforcement, military garrisons, sent to protect the tracks and suppress any resistance. Conflicts erupted. The Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and other tribes fought back in what became a series of bloody wars, some labelled uprisings, others outright massacres. From Red Cloud's War to the Battle of Little Bighorn, the railroads were both the battleground and the prize. Eventually, resistance was crushed. Indigenous nations were confined to reservations, often hundreds of miles from their ancestral lands. The psychological toll was immense. Sacred sites were desecrated. Hunting patterns were broken. Nomadic cultures, built around seasonal migration and vast open space, were forced into fixed locations under constant surveillance, and all of it was justified in the name of progress. The Transcontinental Railroad was hailed as a marvel of American ingenuity, but it came at the cost of 1,000 nations' dreams. It wasn't just the iron that cut through the land, it was the erasure of a way of life, replaced by timetables and timbers. History books often praise the railroad for uniting a nation, but for native peoples, it tore theirs apart. When the final spike was driven at Promontory Summit in 1869, it wasn't just the end of a railroad, it was the beginning of a new American identity, faster, hungrier, and increasingly shaped by steel and steam. The Transcontinental Railroad shrank the country. What had once taken 6 months by wagon or ship now took 7 days by rail. It changed how people moved, how goods were exchanged, and how the very idea of distance was understood. Suddenly, the concept of a coast-to-coast nation wasn't a dream. It was a daily reality. The railroad fueled the rise of time zones, created to coordinate cross-country travel and commerce. It reorganized agriculture, allowing farmers to send produce across state lines. It powered the Second Industrial Revolution, enabling raw materials to flow efficiently into urban factories. The rhythm of the country began to match the clatter of trains. Culturally, the railroad reinforced a sense of manifest destiny, the belief that America was meant to span from Atlantic to Pacific. It made expansion feel not just possible, but inevitable. With rails stretching across deserts, mountains, and plains, there was no longer a wild frontier. Everything felt reachable. Everything felt claimable. But the railroad also set the template for corporate power in America. Massive wealth accumulated at the top. Men like Leland Stanford, Thomas Durant, and Collis Huntington didn't just get rich, they shaped policy, bought politicians, and built empires. Corruption scandals like the Credit Mobilier affair exposed how deeply railroad interests were embedded in government. For labourers, the train tracks marked both opportunity and exploitation. For indigenous peoples, it marked the end of a world. For the environment, it brought radical change. Forests cleared, rivers bridged, buffalo nearly exterminated. Yet for all its costs, the railroad undeniably stitched the fabric of a modern America. It connected immigrants to opportunity, businesses to markets, and governments to distant territories. It transformed an experimental republic into a fully integrated nation. The iron rails didn't just carry passengers, they carried ambition, destruction, hope, and hubris. The railroad was both a triumph and a tragedy. And once those twin locomotives touched cowcatchers in the Utah desert, the country was never the same again. The nation was transformed, not by war or election, but by iron and fire.